Section 21 no-fault evictions being abolished sometime in 2025, maybe the summer or the autumn. How will the new system work if a landlord wants to get their property back once the Renters' Rights Act is in force? How will they be able to do it without Section 21? In this video, I explain what's happening and how the new process will work in practice. This is called Section 8, and it comes from Section 8 of the Housing Act, and you'll hear me talk about that a lot, but that's what that means. I'll also talk about what reasons landlords will be able to give to get their property back, and these are called grounds. Make sure you stay until the end because I'm going to share details on what we know about the transition arrangements and what the options are for landlords whose tenants are in a fixed term at the moment. I'm Suzanne Smith, lawyer turned landlord, and I run the Independent Landlord website and YouTube channel to provide straightforward, practical information for landlords and property businesses without all the politics. You can subscribe to my free weekly newsletter on the independentlandlord.com/subscribe. This is part 3 in my series, Renters' Rights Bill Explained, in which I bring my legal expertise and real-world experience as a landlord to break down what's in the Renters' Rights Bill so I can help landlords and property businesses understand what's coming and prepare for it. In part 1, I explained how the Renters' Rights Bill will change tenancies, and in part 2, I went through what landlords will need to do differently. You don't need to have watched those to watch this video, but you can always go back and watch them afterwards. And there's a lot packed in this video, and I put all the links I mentioned in the description on YouTube. But if you want more detail in writing, I've got a big blog post on this, and you can find it on the independentlandlord.com RRB-grounds. I'm recording this video in November 2024, and I'm basing it on the draft of the Renters' Rights Bill as published and passed by the House of Commons Public Bill Committee. If you find value in this video, please do give it a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to a new channel like mine. Right, let's get started. Let's start at the very beginning. What is a Section 21 notice? Well, here's a clip from Angela Rayner.
So this government will remove the threat of arbitrary evictions by finally bringing to an end no-fault evictions.
Many landlords might disagree with the use of the words arbitrary and no fault. But I promised no politics in this video, so I'm going to keep with neutral language by referring to it as no reason given. And I use the phrase no reason given deliberately because it's very rare that a landlord will terminate a tenancy and serve a Section 21 notice if they don't have a reason. And most of the time it's because the landlord might be selling up, the tenant is in rent arrears, or they're not looking after the property, and they might have antisocial behaviour or might be running a cannabis farm. And apart from a small minority of landlords who use Section 21 to evict tenants who complain, most landlords who use Section 21 will have a reason. I've used it once myself when I sold a flat that the service charge was so high and I wasn't making much money on it. And I used a Section 21 notice then. So how does it work? This is the rules at the moment. A landlord can serve 2 months' notice on tenants and ask them to leave the property. And they do this using Form 6A, which is on the government website. And they can't do it in the first 6 months of a tenancy or during a fixed term unless there's a break clause. It's really easy to do because you don't need evidence. You just fill in the form, and as long as you've jumped through a few hoops, like giving the tenant a signed gas safety certificate before they move in, protecting the deposit, serving the prescribed information, all of that sort of thing, then the judge will grant the landlord an order for possession if it ends up going to court, because it's a no-fault basis. It means that nothing has to be proved. And something important to flag about Section 21 is that most tenants, when they receive a Section 21 notice, they just move out. They want to get on with their life, and it doesn't end up going to court. And what we don't know is whether that's going to be the same thing with the new system. So let's move on to Section 8. Well, the new Section 8, because the Renters' Rights Bill does change it a fair bit. So the big difference between Section 8 and Section 21 is, whereas with Section 21, landlords don't need to give a reason, it's different with Section 8. It's all about giving reasons, and these are called grounds in the Housing Act 1988. And there are two different types of grounds: mandatory and discretionary. For mandatory grounds, so long as the landlord has evidence to prove the ground, the judge must grant the landlord an order for possession. And so it's all about the proof for that, because otherwise after that it will be automatic. So let's move on to what the main grounds will be after the Renters' Rights Bill comes into force that landlords will be able to use if they do want to regain possession of their property. So the first one, and this is new, it's mandatory ground 1A to cover when the landlord is selling up. So the landlord who wants to sell with vacant possession is able to apply, is able to use ground 1A if they are seeking possession because they intend to sell. They can't do that in the first 12 months of a tenancy, and that's taken from when the tenant actually moves in. If there's been successive renewals with fixed terms, or then it will be when they moved in. The clock doesn't get restarted when the Renters' Rights Bill comes in. It will go from when the tenant moved into the property. So can't do it in the first 12 months of a new tenancy. And you must give 4 months notice to the tenant of your intention to sell, and that you're using Section 8 ground for possession for this. Now, we don't yet know what proof a judge will need, but the judge will have to be satisfied that this ground is proven that the landlord does genuinely want to sell the property, intend to sell the property. So that was the first one. The second one is similar, and that's mandatory ground 1. It's already in the Housing Act now, but it's going to be changed a little bit. And mandatory ground 1 is when a landlord wants to move in a family. So the definition of family is very wide. It includes the landlord's spouse or civil partner, and the landlord's parent, grandparent, sibling, child, or grandchild. And it also includes a curiously termed half-blood relations, but does not include cousins or nieces or nephews. But half-blood does sound very Harry Potter. The landlord will need to satisfy the judge that they or a member of their extended family genuinely intends to move in. For both of these, the landlord won't be able to relet or remarket the property for a restricted period of 12 months from when the notice is served or from when a claim form is issued. And a landlord or an agent will commit an offence if they let or market the property during this 12-month period. And it's the same, they can't put it on Airbnb either to get around it. Although an agent will have a defence if they can prove that they took all reasonable steps to avoid it. So let's move to the next category of grounds, which is rent arrears. And there are 2 separate grounds for rent arrears. The first one is mandatory ground 8. And a landlord needs to give 4 weeks notice, and the rent arrears need to be at least 3 months rent arrears, both at the time of the service and at the hearing. Now, this is a change from at the moment where it's 2 months, and it's been unpopular with landlords. But there is another ground, and that's ground 10, and that is a discretionary ground for any type of rent arrears. So it might cover the situation where you have a tenant who's clearly gaming the system and they've got 3 months less 1 day in arrears and had that for a while. And then a landlord might be able to apply to get an order for possession and explain to the judge what's been happening and hope that the judge believes that it's fair and reasonable in the circumstances to evict the tenant. The next category is antisocial behaviour. And just as we have with rent arrears, there are 2 different types of grounds for antisocial behaviour. The first is for the most serious, and it's referred to as serious antisocial behaviour, ground 7A. It's mandatory, but the landlord needs to prove that the tenant has been guilty of criminal behaviour. And so that's a very high bar. And so there's a list of them, and I've got more details in my blog post. For less serious antisocial behaviour, there's ground 14, which is a discretionary ground. And so a landlord can apply to the court for possession where the antisocial behaviour isn't that in the list of crimes. So it will include, nuisance, annoyance, illegal or immoral use of the property. And as it's a discretionary ground, it means that the court has a discretion to decide whether or not to grant possession. So ground 14 is significantly wider than ground 7A, and it will include behaviour that hasn't actually ended up in a conviction, and neighbours and other tenants can provide supporting evidence for the harm that the tenant's behaviour has caused. Judges have to consider several factors when deciding whether to grant a possession order, and they'll only do it if it's reasonable. So landlords will need to provide evidence that shows that antisocial behaviour is persistent and warrants eviction, and the judge will make their decision based on the quality of the evidence and the seriousness of the behaviour. And so in that case, you'd need witness statements, evidence of police involvement, and evidence of steps taken to address the behaviour. And when somebody's in an HMO, the court will be able to take into account the effect that the behaviour has on the people who share the facilities in that HMO. Speaking of HMOs, the next ground is ground 4A, and that is a mandatory ground that covers HMO students who are in full-time education. This is a new ground, and the landlord will need to comply with quite a few things, more hoops, jumping through hoops again. So the first thing is it needs to be an HMO. And so that means it doesn't necessarily have to have a license, but it needs to have 3 or more tenants sharing common facilities who aren't in the same household. So for more details on that, you can see my blog post, The Landlord Guide to HMO Properties. So the next hurdle is the student test. And the tenants must all be full-time students, or the landlord has to have reasonable grounds to believe they will become full-time students during the tenancy. So if they enter into the tenancy agreement and they're a fresher, they're about to go and study, or they're about to start on an MA, and they have provided evidence to the landlord that they're due to start the course, that would be okay. And the students must be studying full-time in one of a big list of higher education courses. So that's a student test. The landlord must give the tenants a written statement of their wish to be able to recover possession on the basis that they met the student test at the start of the tenancy, and that they intend on the next occasion to let it to students who meet the student test. The notice itself must be at least 4 months and needs to expire between June and September. And so the intention is that that's at the end of the academic year. Now, quite a lot of people have been asking, well, what happens if the tenants have already entered into an agreement before the Renters' Rights Act comes into place? Well, there will be transition arrangements. So if there are existing tenancies when the Renters' Rights Act comes into force, provided the tenants met the student test when they originally entered into the tenancy, the landlord will be able to use ground 4A if the landlord has serves the written statement within 1 month of the commencement date of the Renters' Rights Act. something to remember to do. The landlord can't serve this notice, get the students out, and then let to people who aren't students. The landlord must genuinely intend to let the property to full-time students or those who the landlord believes will become full-time students during the tenancy. So with Section 21 going, people have been looking at Section 8 to see what else is there, apart from the ones I've already mentioned. And there are a few discretionary grounds that might be useful. The first thing is breach of tenancy agreement. This is ground 12, discretionary, and only 2 weeks needs to be given. And so it's unchanged in the Renters' Rights Bill, and it entitles a landlord to seek possession if the tenant breaches a term of the tenancy agreement other than rent. So it might include failing to allow the landlord in to carry out maintenance or to do a gas safety certificate, or subletting, or not looking after the garden, not looking after the property. And so this is I think that this ground will be used more and more once the Renters' Rights Act comes into force. But of course, you're going to need evidence. As with all discretionary grounds, the judge will need to agree it's reasonable to evict the tenant because of the breach of contract. It can't be for something trivial. Say, for instance, if it says in the contract that a tenant has to pay by standing order and they don't pay by standing order and they're not in arrears, that's a trivial thing. You won't be able to terminate because of this. Another one that people have asked me about is redevelopment by the landlord, and that's ground 6. It's a mandatory ground. But redevelopment doesn't just mean replacing a bathroom or replacing a kitchen, because the landlord must show that they intend to demolish or reconstruct the whole or a substantial part of the building to carry out substantial works to the whole or a considerable part of the property. And they must be able to show that the work can't reasonably be done while the tenants are living in the property. Now, when it comes to redoing a bathroom, people all the time continue to live in a property when they're having their bathroom changed, and you might be able to ask the tenants to move out for a week or to give them access to an Airbnb where they can take a shower or something. And so I don't think if you're just replacing the bathroom or a kitchen, that's enough. I think it would have to be a back to brick refurbishment or substantial rebuilding of the property. But it's worth bearing in mind this. We'll now move on to what's the process for evicting tenants using Section 8. Now, there are several parts to the process, and it's actually not that different from Section 21. It's just that Section 21, most of them don't go through the full process. So I'll go through it now. The first one is to serve the notice and to give us the amount of notice that you have to, that's stated in the Renters' Rights Bill. So it might be 4 weeks, might be 4 months. And when more than 14 days have passed since the notice expired, and the tenants haven't moved out, then the landlord will then need to commence proceedings for an order for possession. And it can take a little time for the proceedings to be issued according to the county court. So that's the next stage. After that, there'll be a hearing at which the judge will listen to both sides put their case. Sometimes the tenants don't turn up, and the judge will need to decide if there's enough evidence to support a ground, to support a case using mandatory grounds, or whether it's reasonable to evict the tenants if there's a discretionary ground. And if the landlord can prove this, and the judge is happy and satisfied, then the landlord will receive a possession order. And if the tenants don't move out by a date that's specified on the possession order, then the landlord won't be able to change the locks. They'll have to appoint bailiffs to go and to ask the tenants to leave. And so this process is very similar to Section 21. It's just a bit more paper-based in the accelerated procedure at the moment with Section 21. And although with Section 21, if it's a valid notice, the landlord just won't have to prove any grounds. But as I said before, most tenants do move out when they receive a Section 21 notice and it doesn't go to court. So another issue that people have been very concerned about is the backlog in the court, the county courts. It's not just to be hearing the possession claims, but it's also the bailiff's procedure as well. So let's hear what Angela Rayner has to say about it.
I also know and do recognise the huge pressures on the court system as a whole, caused by years of Tory failure and neglect. And this is why, to support the changes, we will be digitising the county court possession process, working closely with colleagues in the Ministry of Justice to create a modern, efficient service for our courts.
Well, we'll have to see what happens with the backlog in the courts and also with the bailiffs. And as with all government IT projects, it's not going to come into force overnight, and there's bound to be teething problems. But one thing's sure, the government are not going to wait until the courts have cleared the backlog. They're not going to hold up the abolition of Section 21 until that, which is what the Conservatives were intending to do.
We are not prepared to make the necessary and long overdue transformation of the private rented sector contingent on an unspecified degree of future court improvements subjectively determined by ministers, as the last government proposed in their legislation.
The next topic is, when is it all going to come into effect? When will landlords no longer be able to serve Section 21 notices and have to use Section 8 notices? Well, in the first video that I did in this series, part 1, I explained the new tenancy system, and this abolition of Section 21 is part of that new tenancy system. And Matthew Pennycook has previously said that it might come into effect on the commencement date in the summer of 2025, but I think it's more likely to be the autumn of 2025. So we'll have to see. And after that date, the commencement date, no new Section 21 notices will be able to serve. And we're now moving on to the transition arrangements, which is the bonus I mentioned at the beginning. What happens in the interim period? And the bill does have transition arrangements, but it's a bit complicated. So if you've served a Section 21 notice before the commencement date, let's call it 1st of October, then that notice will still be valid, and the tenancy will remain an assured short-hold tenancy until then, and the landlord will be able to enforce the notice by bringing an order for possession until they are time barred. In terms of the time bar, landlords will need to commence proceedings for an order for possession within 3 months of the commencement date, and even earlier if the notice was served more than 2 months before the commencement date. Otherwise, they'll be time barred. And there's often a backlog in the court, so landlords should err on the safe side. If the Section 21 notice expires more than 3 months after the commencement date, it won't work. The landlord won't be able to do anything. So I know that there's people that are concerned that, say they've got a fixed term contract that is due to expire in November and the Act comes into force on the 1st of October, they won't be able to serve a Section 21 notice. To recap, the landlord must commence proceedings for an order for possession before the earliest of these 3 dates to avoid being time barred. 6 months from the date of the notice, 4 months from the expiry of the 2 months notice in the Section 21 notice, and 3 months from the commencement date. So this means that the landlord must not serve a Section 21 notice too early, otherwise they might be time barred. And they do need to allow enough time for the court to issue the paperwork. And so it is strongly advised, I strongly advise you to take legal advice on this from specialist solicitors and not leave it to eviction specialists, because this is complicated. It is bad enough me trying to explain it. And and you can check to see whether an outfit is properly regulated with the Solicitors Regulation Authority by checking on their checker online, and I'll put a link in the show notes. So that was quite a lot we packed in there. And this brings me to the end of this training session on what happens when Section 21 is abolished and a landlord wants to regain possession of their properties. So if you've got this far, Well done. And it would be great if you could subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on future videos. Or if you don't want to subscribe, I don't always subscribe, then at least please give me a thumbs up. It will really help this new channel. And I'm here to provide you with free, straightforward, practical information for landlords and property businesses without all the politics and the clickbait headlines. And if you haven't seen my other videos, part 1 explains how the Renters' Rights Bill will change tenancies. And in part 2, I talk about what landlords will need to do differently when the rules come into force. And the next video is going to be a summary of what are all these renters' rights. See you soon.